Stoicism is absolutely booming right now. Books by Seneca and Marcus Aurelius are selling millions of copies, and blogs dedicated to Stoic wisdom get thousands of likes. We are constantly told to control what we can and accept what we can't. It sounds like the perfect recipe for happiness in our chaotic modern world. But what if I told you that this philosophy might not be a lifeline, but actually a cunning trap? What if strictly following the Stoics' teachings could make you weaker, not stronger, and ultimately more miserable? Today, we are not here to praise ancient philosophers. We are going to put Stoicism through a brutal stress test and expose its biggest flaws. You're about to learn about the dark side of this philosophy, the parts that popular self-help coaches never talk about, ready to challenge the emperor philosopher himself. Let's dive in. Before we start our critique, let's quickly recap what Stoicism actually is. It originated in ancient Greece around the 3rd century BC, founded by Zeno of Citium. But it was the Romans who really made it famous. Seneca, the incredibly wealthy advisor, Epictetus, the former slave turned teacher, and of course Marcus Aurelius, the emperor of Rome. Their teachings rest on a few core ideas. First, virtue is the only true good. Not money, not fame, but moral perfection alone. Second is the famous dichotomy of control, the need to separate things into what is within our power, our thoughts, judgments and desires, and what is not, our health, reputation, or the weather. And third, the goal of life is ataraxia, or tranquility of the spirit, and apatheia, but not in the modern sense of apathy. They meant freedom from destructive passions and emotions. It all sounds noble and logical, but as they say, the devil is in the details, and those are the very details we are about to rip apart. So the first and perhaps most significant issue with Stoicism is its approach to emotions. The Stoics advocate for impassiveness, a state where external events don't trigger intense feelings. Anger, fear, sadness, and even intense joy. All these are seen as passions of the soul that prevent us from living a virtuous life. They believed emotions were simply the result of mistaken judgments. If someone insults you and you become angry, it means you have mistakenly judged the insult to be a harmful evil. The ideal Stoic would analyse the situation and realise that the words of others simply cannot harm them. It's a beautiful idea, but modern psychology looks at this completely differently. Emotions aren't cognitive errors. They are vital signals from our bodies, evolutionary mechanisms that help us survive and navigate the world. For example, fear signals danger, and anger signals that our boundaries have been violated. Trying to suppress them using reason alone is like trying to turn off a fire alarm while the house is burning down. Let's take a closer look at the idea of emotional suppression. What exactly happens when you constantly tell yourself, "I shouldn't be feeling this"? Research shows that suppressed emotions don't simply vanish. They accumulate, often manifesting as psychosomatic illnesses, anxiety disorders, depression, or sudden, uncontrollable outbursts of rage. Imagine a pot of boiling water. You seal the lid tightly and place it on high heat. Sooner or later, that lid is going to blow. Stoicism fundamentally proposes exactly this, holding that lid down with all your might, relying purely on sheer willpower. Instead of learning to understand, accept, and constructively process our emotions, this philosophy suggests waging a constant internal war against them. This is a hugely draining approach, and in the long run, it is an unsustainable and losing battle. The next logical step, following from that, is the erosion of empathy. If you condition yourself to be indifferent to your own suffering, how can you genuinely feel empathy for someone else's? A Stoic might respond, "I hear your sorrow, but remember that the true harm isn't in external events, but in the judgment you place upon them." That sounds like intellectually astute, but utterly cold advice, and it's unlikely to comfort someone who has just lost a loved one. Genuine emotional connection with others relies fundamentally on our ability to share their feelings. The relentless pursuit of Stoic apatheia risks turning a person into a detached, cold observer, incapable of deep attachment or intimacy. He might be fair and ethical, but will he be a loving friend, partner, or parent? That ultimately is the crucial question. Now let's turn our attention to the famous Stoic dichotomy of control. The concept of dividing the world into things we control and things we don't is brilliant precisely because of its simplicity. It's truly effective at cutting down on anxiety, but it comes with a dangerous downside. This concept drastically oversimplifies reality. The world isn't black and white. There is a huge grey zone, things we can certainly influence, but never completely control. Take your health, for instance. You can't control it entirely, but you absolutely influence it through diet, exercise, and lifestyle choices. Or think about your career. You don't control your boss's decision on a promotion, but you strongly influence that outcome through the quality of your work. Stoicism, however, often pushes us toward these two extremes, either demanding full control or demanding complete acceptance. This can tragically lead people to simply throw in the towel, giving up in situations where they could have genuinely made a difference. Furthermore, an obsession with the Stoic dichotomy of control can quickly lead to serious social passivity. Imagine widespread corruption and injustice thriving in your country. A strict Stoic might simply shrug and say, "That's outside my control. I can only manage my own internal reactions." And instead of fighting for real change, they'll be busy meditating on virtue, safely isolated in their ivory tower. History, however, is full of examples of people who refused to accept things being outside their control and fundamentally changed the world. The civil rights movement, the great struggles for independence, the major scientific revolutions, these were all driven by individuals who absolutely rejected the passive framework prescribed by Stoicism. A philosophy that advocates for the passive acceptance of injustice may be convenient for those in power, but it is deeply dangerous for society as a whole. Here is another trap embedded in the dichotomy of control: hidden victim blaming. Imagine someone who has been the victim of a serious crime or systemic discrimination. A hardline Stoic might respond, "The event itself is not evil. Your judgment of it is the evil. You are suffering not because of what happened, but because of how you perceive it." Essentially, this shifts the responsibility entirely from the aggressor onto the victim. Instead of condemning the injustice, this logic demands that the victim work on their internal perceptions. This approach is not only cruel, but completely counterproductive. Sometimes the problem truly isn't our perception. It's a terrible reality that needs to be changed, not simply accepted. Now let's look at how the Stoics viewed pleasure. They were highly suspicious of it. They argued that the pursuit of gratification turns a person into a slave to their own desires and distracts them from what truly matters: virtue. This is why they embraced asceticism, consciously denying themselves basic comfort. For instance, they slept on hard surfaces, ate simple food, and wore modest clothing. While there's undeniable wisdom in that approach, when taken to its absolute extreme, this philosophy strips life of its colour. Life isn't just about duty and virtue. It's also about good food, great music, travel, love, and friendship. To completely forgo these simple human pleasures in the name of abstract virtue is essentially to willfully impoverish your own existence. Modern psychology emphasises the critical role positive emotions play in maintaining mental health. Stoicism, by contrast, seems to offer us a diet consisting only of the plain, unleavened bread of virtue. Moving on, we're focusing on the concept of amor fati, the love of fate. This idea was particularly championed by Marcus Aurelius. The core premise is not just accepting everything that happens, but embracing and loving it, seeing it as an essential piece of the universe's grand design. Lost your job? Fantastic. That's fate handing you a fresh opportunity. Got sick? Perfect. It's a trial for your spirit. On one hand, this is a powerful psychological tool for overcoming hardship. On the other, it can quickly devolve into toxic positivity and pure self-deception. Sometimes bad things are just bad things. Full stop. You don't need to force yourself to love tragedy or injustice. It's crucial to acknowledge your true feelings, process them, and allow yourself to feel pain instead of forcing artificial happiness. Amor fati risks becoming a beautiful form of reality denial, a sophisticated mask covering up suppressed pain. It's also worth asking who this philosophy was originally intended for. Seneca was one of the wealthiest men in Rome. Marcus Aurelius was the emperor. They possessed the power, the resources, and the status necessary to philosophize about detachment from external goods. When you have everything, it's easy to say that money and fame don't matter. Now imagine a slave or a poor person in ancient Rome. Could they truly practice indifference to hunger, cold, and beatings? Stoicism is often criticized for its elitism. Yes, there was Epictetus, who was himself a slave, but his teachings were arguably more of a survival strategy in inhumane conditions, rather than a universal recipe for happiness. For a person struggling just for basic survival, discussions about virtue can sound like a cruel joke. The Stoic view on death presents yet another point of contention. They famously taught that death was not to be feared, viewing it as a natural, inevitable phase of life. Furthermore, they considered suicide an acceptable option, a reasonable exit, if life became truly unbearable or obstructed a virtuous existence. Seneca, for example, committed suicide following Nero's orders. This very notion of a rational departure can be profoundly dangerous. In the modern world, where our understanding of depression and other mental health disorders is vastly superior, romanticizing suicide as a high philosophical act is simply irresponsible. Someone suffering from profound depression might easily adopt Stoic logic to justify their decision when what they truly need is professional help, not Seneca quotes. The line here between courageously accepting the end and merely fleeing from solvable problems is dangerously thin. Let's revisit the Stoic notion that virtue is the only true good. That sets a tremendously high bar. The Stoics believed you were either completely virtuous, a sage, or you were not. There was no in-between. Crucially, everyone who failed to reach this ideal was considered equally vicious. In this view, a starving person who stole a loaf of bread was just as far removed from virtue as a cruel and ruthless tyrant. This kind of black and white ethical framework leaves no room for human weakness, simple mistakes, or gradual moral development. It demands instant, perfect behavior, which is impossible for most people and often leads only to feelings of guilt and inadequacy. In contrast, modern ethical systems are far more flexible, taking into account context, intention, and the actual consequences of actions. Let's explore Stoic physics and cosmology. The ancient Stoics believed the world was a single, living organism, infused with divine reason, or the logos. All events were predetermined, operating as part of this universal plan. This foundational belief is what supported their entire system of ethics, the necessity of living in agreement with nature, meaning this rational, universal plan. But what happens when we remove that foundational premise? Modern science does not support the existence of a universal logos. From a scientific standpoint, the universe is generally viewed as chaotic and indifferent, rather than rational and orderly. If there is no divine plan whatsoever, the entire concept of living in agreement with nature completely loses its original, intended meaning. Modern Stoicism attempts to bypass this problem by interpreting nature instead as human nature, but that shift fundamentally transforms the philosophy into something else entirely. The next problem we run into is the potential suppression of ambition. If external goods, things like career success, achievement, and recognition, don't matter, why bother striving for them? A Stoic might argue that you should strive for the virtuous process, not the result. But in practice, this can easily drain away all your drive and motivation. An entrepreneur who is truly indifferent to the success of their business is unlikely to ever make it big. Similarly, a scientist who doesn't care whether they make a discovery will probably never achieve one. Healthy ambition and the desire to achieve something meaningful in the external world are powerful engines of progress, both personal and societal. Stoicism, however, risks transforming this crucial engine into nothing more than a quiet harbour of self-sufficiency, where ultimately nothing happens. Let's dive into the topic of relationships. The Stoics definitely valued friendship and social connections, but their approach was highly specific. They held that we should love our dear ones, yet remain prepared to lose them at any moment without excessive grief. Epictetus, for example, advised that when you kiss your child, you should remind yourself they are merely mortal. The rationale is that when the child inevitably dies, you won't be overwhelmed by intense sorrow. But doesn't this fundamentally destroy the very essence of love itself? Love is vulnerability. It is the willingness to suffer for the sake of another person. In attempting to insure ourselves against future heartache, the Stoic risks never experiencing true deep attachment. This is love with the anesthesia already running. This preemptive numbness dulls not just the potential pain of loss, but also the vibrant joy of closeness itself. Another aspect worth considering is the lack of concrete methodologies. Stoicism provides us with high-level principles. Live virtuously, control your judgments, and accept your fate. But how exactly do you put those into practice? Take Marcus Aurelius, for instance. In his Meditations, he constantly reminds himself of these tenets, but it often feels more like self-affirmation than a clear, step-by-step system. Contrast this with modern psychotherapeutic approaches such as cognitive behavioral therapy or CBT, which incidentally borrowed heavily from the Stoics. CBT offers tangible techniques, structured journaling, challenging automatic negative thoughts, and behavioral experiments. With Stoicism, however, things often remain on the level of abstract slogans, forcing individuals to figure out on their own how to operationalize those concepts. That's a significant hurdle that many people struggle to overcome. The Stoic ideal of the sage is fundamentally an impossible standard to meet. The Stoics saw the sage as faultless, completely rational, immune to emotion, or impassive, always acting correctly and never making an error in judgment. Throughout the entire history of Stoicism, the philosophers themselves couldn't point to a single real person who fully lived up to this ideal. Perhaps only mythical figures like Hercules ever came close. Holding up such a superhuman standard can be seriously demotivating. Instead of inspiring us to become the best versions of ourselves, this shining yet lifeless image can make us feel perpetually inadequate, like we're constantly failing. This tension feeds relentless perfectionism, which is often a direct route straight to burnout. Stoicism, paradoxically, can foster isolation. This philosophy places a huge, almost singular focus on the inner citadel and radical self-sufficiency. The core maxim, "all that is necessary for happiness is within," is a beautiful sentiment. However, it often risks leading us to neglect the external world and the people in it. Humans are fundamentally social beings. We thrive on support, community, connection, and a strong sense of belonging. A Stoic who becomes overly zealous in constructing this inner fortress risks becoming completely trapped and isolated within it. He may become invulnerable, but he will also be profoundly detached. And as numerous psychological studies demonstrate, genuine human happiness is simply unattainable in total isolation. Next up is the issue of interpretation. What we refer to as Stoicism today is often a heavily simplified, modern, and frankly, sanitized version. Popular books and blogs cherry-pick the most appealing concepts, like control, tranquility, and acceptance, while tossing out the complex metaphysical framework, rigorous logic, and ethical paradoxes. The result is Stoicism Light, essentially a collection of convenient life hacks aimed at boosting personal productivity. But that's not the philosophy Seneca or Marcus Aurelius actually lived by. It's more of a commercial product, one that sells the idea of tranquility, but conveniently leaves out the real cost: emotional detachment and social passivity. The Stoic disdain for the body offers yet another point for critique. To the Stoics, the body was merely external, indifferent, and sometimes even a prison for the soul. Pain, illness, and physical pleasures were deemed completely irrelevant to a life of virtue. This approach entirely ignores the inseparable link between the mind and body, a link thoroughly confirmed by modern neuroscience. Our overall well-being, mood, and cognitive abilities are directly tied to the condition of our physical body. Caring for your body, listening to its signals, and enjoying physical sensations is not a weakness. It is an essential part of a healthy and fulfilling life. To neglect the body in the name of the spirit is quite simply a dangerous delusion. We should also mention the system's rigidity, its fundamental lack of flexibility. Stoicism offers a universal template for every life situation. Apply reason, distinguish the controllable from the uncontrollable, and strive for virtue. But life is far more complex and nuanced than that. Sometimes the right solution isn't pure reason, but intuition. Sometimes we need not acceptance, but the will to fight. And sometimes the key isn't virtue, but simple compassion or mercy. By attempting to cram the entire wealth of human experience onto the Procrustean bed of a few core philosophical principles, Stoicism strips us of flexibility, the essential ability to adapt and find unique solutions for unique problems. It provides a map, but the actual terrain is constantly shifting beneath our feet. Another area of concern relates to how we view the past and the future. Stoics famously urge us to live strictly in the here and now, neither regretting the past nor worrying about the future. And certainly, there is sound logic to this approach. However, completely ignoring the past and the future ultimately diminishes us. Analysing past experiences, especially our mistakes, is the crucial key to learning and personal growth. Planning for the future, setting concrete goals, and pursuing our dreams, these elements provide us with hope and essential direction. A Stoic who is utterly fixated on the present moment risks becoming a person without a story and without an outlook, merely drifting through life, passively reacting with virtue to momentary stimuli. It's fascinating to look at Stoicism through the lens of creativity. The creative process is often fueled by powerful emotions, love, anger, longing, or ecstasy. Truly great works of art are rarely born from a state of complete calm and composure. Could Dostoevsky have written his novels had he been a Stoic? Could Beethoven have composed his symphonies had he faced his deafness with utter indifference? The quest for emotional detachment might make life smoother and more predictable, but it risks extinguishing the inner fire from which everything new and great is born. Let's dive into the concept of duty. For the Stoics, particularly Roman figures like Marcus Aurelius, the fulfillment of one's duty to society, family, and the state was paramount. It was the foundation for creating strong and responsible citizens. But what happens when that duty conflicts with personal happiness or individual conscience? What if the state demands that you commit unjust acts? Unfortunately, Stoicism doesn't offer a clear framework for resolving these conflicts. An overemphasis on duty can easily lead to individuals suppressing their personal needs and desires, serving a system even when it is fundamentally flawed or corrupt. It is the philosophy of the ideal soldier, perhaps, but not always of the free individual. Let's now turn our attention to Stoic logic. They were masterful logicians, but their arguments frequently rely on undemonstrated premises. Take, for instance, the assertion, virtue is the only good. But why? The Stoic answer is that virtue alone cannot be taken away from us and is entirely within our control. However, that's not proof. It's merely a convenient definition. With equal validity, one could assert that the sole good is, say, health or love, and construct an entire ethical framework around that idea. Ultimately, many of Stoicism's core tenets are less the product of rigorous logical deduction and more fundamental axioms that require acceptance purely on faith. Stoicism can also prove ineffective when dealing with deep-seated psychological trauma. If someone experienced abuse or neglect as a child, those events leave profound wounds on their psyche. Telling a person like that to simply alter your judgments about the past is the equivalent of offering a band-aid for a complex fracture. Healing trauma requires not just philosophical reflection, but deep psychotherapeutic work that addresses emotions, bodily sensations, and unconscious conditioning. In this context, Stoicism is, at best, useless, and at worst, actively harmful, because it compels the individual to ignore their pain instead of actually healing it. What about the concepts of joy and happiness? The Stoics talk about a good flow of life, but their definition of happiness is highly specific. For them, it's less about active joy and more about the absence of suffering. It's a quiet satisfaction derived from recognizing your own virtue. However, most people define happiness differently. They seek euphoria, enthusiasm, deep passion, and peak experiences. A philosophy that regards all strong positive emotions with suspicion offers a rather bland, colourless version of the good life. This is the contentment of a sage secluded in a cell, not the fiery happiness of an artist, a lover, or a trailblazer. The Stoic approach to errors also merits scrutiny. The perfect Stoic sage doesn't make mistakes. The rest of us? We stumble constantly. Yet Stoicism doesn't provide a clear, practical mechanism for learning from these errors. Instead, it primarily urges us to use our rational mind to avoid them altogether. But mistakes are an unavoidable part of the human condition and our most vital source of learning. The modern approach, built on the concept of a growth mindset, argues that we shouldn't fear mistakes, but rather view them as prime opportunities for development. Conversely, Stoicism, with its ideal of infallibility, can actually breed a fear of failure, hindering our ability to take risks and try new things. It is fascinating how often Stoicism is contrasted with Epicureanism. Epicureans also aimed for tranquility, but they saw the path to it lying through moderate pleasures and the active avoidance of suffering. They valued friendship, a calm existence, and the absence of pain. In a sense, their approach was arguably more humane and realistic. The contemporary preoccupation specifically with Stoicism, rather than Epicureanism, speaks volumes about our society. We live in an era defined by a cult of productivity and relentless self-optimization. Because of this, the rigorous ascetic philosophy of the Stoics feels much more accessible to us than Epicurus's gentle call for quiet contentment. We are searching not so much for happiness as for mental armor, a shield that allows us to withstand ever-increasing demands and higher levels of stress. And finally, the main practical mistake of modern Stoics is simple: cherry-picking. People only take the convenient parts of this complex system. For example, they adopt the idea of accepting what they cannot change, usually to help them tolerate a job they despise, or the concept of indifference to others' opinions, solely to justify their own selfish behaviour. But they conveniently forget the other side of the equation: strict moral duty, serving the community, and constantly working to correct their own vices. The result is not a Stoic sage, but rather a comfortable conformist with an inflated sense of self-worth. Stoicism is a holistic system. Tearing out individual elements distorts its very essence, and frequently ends up being used to the detriment of both themselves and others. To summarise these numerous points of criticism, Stoicism offers a powerful yet profoundly narrow view of the world. It wildly overestimates the power of pure reason, while critically underestimating the essential importance of emotion. It forces the world into an overly simplistic dichotomy, the black and white, the controllable versus the uncontrollable, thereby ignoring the true complexity and rich variety of reality itself. This philosophy can certainly serve a purpose, perhaps as a temporary emotional anesthetic during a crisis, a necessary tool for getting yourself together. However, making it the foundation of your entire life means willingly strapping on blinders. These self-imposed limits narrow your perception of the world, impoverish your emotional palette, and severely restrict your potential for growth, love, and genuine full-blooded happiness. So, what's the final takeaway here? Were Marcus Aurelius, Seneca, and Epictetus just a bunch of misguided old guys? Of course not. Their philosophy is one of the greatest achievements of human thought, helping countless people navigate the darkest of times. But here's the crucial turning point, the major caveat. Stoicism is not scripture, it's a tool. And like any tool, it's brilliant for some tasks and completely inadequate for others. It can be a life raft in a storm, but it can also become the anchor that stops you from sailing further in calm waters. The main mistake we can make today is accepting it as absolute truth. True wisdom isn't about blindly adhering to ancient doctrines. It's about critically assessing them, taking the best parts and discarding what is outdated or simply unsuited for the complex, multifaceted, and emotionally rich life of a 21st century human. Thank you so much for watching this video all the way to the end. If this discussion gave you something to think about, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss our future breakdowns of complex ideas. And now, the crucial question for you. Which Stoic idea do you find the most controversial, or perhaps even detrimental? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Let's start a real philosophical discussion.